You only get one shot to make a character unforgettable, and most writers waste it. I've been writing fantasy for over 20 years now, and when it comes to character development, I've learned one thing. The fastest way to lose a reader is to make your characters feel replaceable. So in this video, I'll be breaking down 3 real submissions from members of the Tale Tinkerers Guild. Writers just like you, working on stories that matter to them. To start, let's look at a piece that leans into memory, voice, and subtle longing, and explore what happens when an introduction trades immediacy for quiet reflection. Here's the first submission from Jan. My late father was the mentor and dearest friend of Captain Christopher A. Davis. Until we returned to his hometown of Baltimore, he spent many days and sometimes weeks in the company of the famous Ratioinator. My late mother, younger sister, and I never had any idea what they were investigating. That is the domain of grown men, Mama explained in her syllabub way when I complained about not being allowed to go. You are just a girl of 7 years. Your main concern now is playing with dolls, memorizing your arithmetic, and practicing your stitches. Of course, I wasn't happy with the response. I wanted to find out why Papa's eyes lit up when Captain Davis sent a note, and he would grab his packed carpet bag and leave for the Davis home on Delphine Street. Now, as a first impression, this piece immediately establishes a mood. It's measured, a little wistful, and strongly grounded in a sense of personal memory. And there's a real strength to that. From the first line, we're not placed in a scene, but in a voice. That's important to notice, because even though we haven't met the protagonist by name, we are already inside their lens. We're hearing how they remember things, how they felt as a child, and how those feelings have lingered over time. What I particularly appreciate here is the restraint. There's no dramatic chase, no magical flair. Instead, we get yearning, a little girl left behind, a world just out of reach, a character who notices everything but isn't invited in. And there is power in that, because one of the foundational principles I teach the writers I am working with is that character introductions don't need to shout, they need to resonate. If your character's internal state, worldview, or emotional need becomes visible within those first few paragraphs, you're already on the right path. And here, Jan has started to sketch that. That said though, the question I always ask when reviewing an intro is this: what exactly do I learn about this character that makes me want to follow them further? And when I apply that to this piece here, what I find is that the setting and backstory are carrying a lot more weight than the character herself, at least in terms of active presence. Let me explain what I mean by that. The opening lines focus heavily on her father and Captain Davis, on what those men were doing, what the family didn't know, and how the child narrator was excluded. We do get a glimpse of her inner frustration, but it's very subtle. Her feelings are told to us more than they are shown. So there's an undercurrent of curiosity and discontent here, but it's filtered through a memory lens, and the result is a kind of distance between us and the character. She's narrating events about other people, not necessarily giving us a reason to invest in her yet. Now that might be intentional. If this story is meant to unfold in a literary or coming-of-age style where the narrator is piecing together past and present, then this reflective distance could absolutely work. But if you want to grab readers right away with a strong sense of who this girl is, then you might want to make her inner voice cut through the memory a little more sharply. So what would I tweak here? Well, first I would start with voice. We've already got a clean, almost formal tone here, which works well for the time period it suggests. But even in historical or stylized narratives, I always encourage writers to give us texture in the inner monologue. Right now, most of the flavor is external. My late father was the mentor, Mama explained in a syllabub way. These are beautifully phrased, but they don't yet tell me what kind of the person the narrator is. So what if she reacted a bit more? Let's say after Mama tells her she's just a young girl of 7, the narrator cuts in, not just with, of course I wasn't happy with the response, but with something a little more colored. Maybe she says, 7 was old enough to sit through Papa's lectures on logic, wasn't it? Or, I didn't want dolls, I wanted a magnifying lens and a mystery. Moments like that let the character show her personality through contrast. That's one of the fastest ways to create connection in an intro, not just telling us what happened, but showing us how the character thinks differently than the world around her. Which brings me to another key concept I emphasize a lot: internal versus external conflict. Currently we're introduced to a situation, a girl who feels left out of her father's mysterious investigations. That's the external dynamic. But what's her internal struggle? What does this exclusion do to her? Does it make her insecure, defiant, resentful of the adults around her? Or does she quietly channel that curiosity into something of her own? A powerful intro will often plant the seeds of this internal tension early on, And we get hints here. We see her unhappiness, her desire to understand why her father was drawn to Davis's company. But I think we could go a little deeper. For example, what did she imagine they were doing? Did she try to eavesdrop? Was she frightened by the secrecy or thrilled by it? Adding in even 1 or 2 lines that show how she coped or responded to being left out can make a big difference in establishing who she is. Because right now she's observing this scene. I'd love to see her press up against it, even just a little. Now, things like that might be included already in what follows after this submission, which was limited to 150 words. The goal here though is to focus on the very first impression a character gives to the reader, and here I think it could benefit from a bit more insights into the narrator's voice early on. Moving on though, let's talk about pacing and rhythm next, because this is another area where character introductions often reveal their intent. This piece has a gentle, almost memoir-like rhythm to it. It's clear, it's clean, and it doesn't try to rush the reader. That is lovely. But if this is the opening to a novel, especially one that needs to compete with today's pace expectations, I would consider in layering a stronger hook. Not something over the top or melodramatic, but maybe something that makes the reader ask a sharper question right away. For example, the first line currently is, "My late father was the mentor and dearest friend of Captain Christopher A. Davis." That's a solid sentence, but it's also passive. It starts with her father's identity, not hers. What if the first line placed her at the center instead? Something like, "I knew Captain Davis long before I ever met him, through my father's stories and through the silence he left behind." Now we're starting with mystery, emotion, and voice, but we're still staying true to the tone already built. No action, no sword fights, just intrigue and intimacy. And that leads me to my last note here. If the goal with this is to evoke a quiet mood to draw the reader in through tone rather than action, then Jan is well on the way. My suggestions are just options to increase character presence and deepen connection early on. And if you'd find it be helpful to get feedback like this on your own work, or just want a place to level up your craft alongside other fantasy writers, then check out the link in the description below. We'd love to welcome you inside the Tale Tinkers Guild. Moving on, let me share a submission with a very different tone. An introduction that brings character voice front and center and does it through movement, mischief, and immediate interaction. This next one comes from Armored Hero 11. As Alaric turned to leave, a familiar, effeminate voice rang out. "Milord, there you are!" Keegan Levlin, his Briarborn yeoman retainer and servant, and his best friend. Alaric barely had time to brace himself before Keegan barreled into him, arms looping around his shoulders in a tight embrace from behind. He felt the yeoman's breasts press into his back. The impact was firm but fleeting, just long enough to make a scene, just short enough to keep Alaric from protesting. Stepping back, Keegan grinned, his features, a mixture of feminine and masculine traits, filled with mischief. Long auburn braids swayed as he moved, while loose strands clung to his sweat-dampened brow. His deep forest green eyes, flecked with copper and gold, gleamed with a familiar mix of exhaustion and triumph, like a hound that had just returned from a mad chase. "Gods above, I've been running all over this cursed town looking for you," Keegan huffed breathless, but unbothered. His accent lilted, a blend of rustic drawl and courtly refinement, as if he couldn't quite settle on one or the other. Now this is a character introduction that leaps off the page right away. Unlike the previous piece, which eased us into a world through memory and mood, this one drops us directly into a moment of physical contact, voice, and emotion. And that boldness works to its advantage. We start with a shout, "Milord, there you are!" And from that instant, we're introduced to not just to Keegan's personality, but also to the dynamic between those two characters. The physicality of the Hawk, the borderline flirtatious tone, the overwhelming energy, everything about Keegan is felt immediately. And that's one of the things I always try to emphasize. Your reader will form a first impression of your character based not on their traits, but their impact. How do they enter this story? How do they change the temperature of the room? What imprint do they leave behind by the time that paragraph ends? Keegan makes an entrance with a capital E. But let's slow down and unpack exactly why that works and where it might be refined depending on the goals of the story. First off, voice and contrast. These are the real strengths of this intro from my point of view. Keegan doesn't just speak, he sounds like someone. There's a textured cadence to his dialogue. "Gods above, I've been running all over this cursed town looking for you," that instantly define him as rustic, energetic, perhaps just a little chaotic. And that rustic, courtly dialect? Fantastic choice. That one small contradiction tells us a ton about the character. He's not just eccentric, he exists between worlds. And that's a great hook for fantasy, where characters often struggle with identity, allegiance, or status. Even his physical description is doing more than world building. The way his auburn braids move, the clinging sweat, the gleam in his eyes, it's not just aesthetics here, it's emotional shorthand. These are sensory cues used to communicate attitude, like mischievous, affectionate, triumphant. That's exactly what good description should do if you ask me. And Alaric's reaction, while brief, helps to frame the scene here. He doesn't protest, he braces. That tells us a lot. There's history here, familiarity, possibly exhaustion. That one verb, braced, adds subtext. And this is often what I encourage writers to aim for when building character relationships in early pages. Not telling us the bond, but showing us its shape through instinctive behavior. That said, let me talk about where this piece could tighten, because there are opportunities to push this even further with only a few small changes. My first note is that the sequence of beats could be refined to enhance flow. As it stands now, we get Keegan's voice, then a block of description, then dialogue again. The issue here for me isn't clarity, it's rhythm. Personally, I often talk about the emotional pacing of a scene. When you pause a conversation with too much description, you risk interrupting the reader's emotional engagement. Especially in high energy intros like this one, it's important to balance momentum with detail. One way to do that is to split or rearrange sentences so that physical description and character action alternate more naturally. For example, "Milord, there you are." Keegan's voice rang out breathless, but bright. Alaric barely had time to brace before the yeoman collided into him, arms looping around his shoulders. "Gods above, I've been running all over this cursed town looking for you," Keegan huffed, only now stepping back and grinning like a hound who'd caught a scent worth chasing. See what that does? It keeps us moving forward while slipping the same information in between beats of dialogue. It's rhythmically tighter and makes Keegan's presence feel more kinetic. Another area to look at is narrative distance and point of view grounding. Right now there's a bit of tonal split between Alaric's point of view and the narrator's voice. For instance, phrases like "his features, a mixture of feminine and masculine traits filled with mischief," are great, but they feel slightly outside Alaric's likely internal lens, unless he's very consciously noting those specifics. If the story is told in third person limited from Alaric's perspective, grounding those details in his perception, even if slightly biased or filtered, might help make feel the moment more real, more internal. For example, instead of "his features, a mixture of feminine and masculine traits," we could frame it as "still that maddening blend of pretty and sharp." Keegan grinned, mischief all over his face like always. This subtle shift brings us further into Alaric's head and adds character voice to the narration itself. And while we're here, let's talk about physicality. The description of Keegan pressing into Alaric's back, the note about his breasts. This is a charged detail. It seems to walk an intentional line between comedic affection and romantic tension. And if that's the desired tone, great. But going for something like this, I'd encourage you to ask what such a moment does narratively. Does it exist purely for humor and eccentricity? Does it subtly flag deeper intimacy? Or does it foreshadow complications in their relationship? It doesn't need to be one thing, but it should do something. Because moments like this, especially early on, shape reader expectations about tone and genre. If you want a flirtatious ambiguity to be part of the emotional landscape of the story, this moment sets that tone really effectively. If not though, it might need adjusting to avoid implying themes that don't get followed through. Moving on, my final suggestion is about stakes. This introduction is pure character, rich, vibrant, and fun. But what are we moving toward? Keegan is exhausted. Alaric was clearly doing something before this. What's the hook that pulls us in further from here? Even a hint, something like "the meeting starts in 10" or "you left the briefing room unlocked," can immediately anchor us in a situation and raise questions. Those little forward beats help make sure a character-driven intro also has a narrative propulsion. Now, having said that, as with the first submission, such details might only be missing due to the submission's word limit. But if not, I'd certainly consider adding something like this here. And in short, overall, this is a strong and memorable entrance. We've got distinctive voice, clear dynamics, and just enough physicality to make the moment feel real. The tweaks I'm suggesting are all about sharpening what's already working, smoothing pacing, deepening perspective, and clarifying stakes. And with that said, next up we have something completely different again. This third piece opens not with energy or memory, but with tension, uncertainty, and a touch of mystery. Let me walk you through Terry's submission. Amanda jumped about 3 feet, whirled, and stared open-mouthed at the man in the middle of the path. Godsend or another nightmare? Kind, dark brown eyes staring back suggested godsend, but tousled, shaggy blonde hair sticking out every which way said sketchy. What's more, she'd swear that crazy hair was bleached. And who dressed like that? Linen tunic, brown loose-fitting leggings tucked into knee-high moccasins like boots, white belt with an empty scabbard attached, and a dusty cloak loosely fastened across the top of his chest. But who was she to judge? She must look like she'd survived a living nightmare, because she had, and she couldn't be sure if the nightmare was done or catching its breath before slamming her with more. Well, on your side, he finally spoke. He had a funny accent that you couldn't place, something with a Latin twist. Now, from the very first line here, we're placed in a moment of disruption. It's not loud, it's not violent, but it immediately breaks something. Amanda's solitude, her momentum, and maybe even her sense of safety. That's a very smart opening beat. Because sometimes the best character introductions aren't about what the character does, they're about what changes when they arrive. And here, that's exactly what happens. One moment, Amanda is moving through a world still echoing with trauma. The next, she's halted, whirling, and confronting the possibility that help and danger might look exactly the same. That tonal ambiguity is the heart of this piece in my opinion. It doesn't rush to define the stranger on the path, it lingers in uncertainty. That's a powerful way to build intrigue, and I'll get into why that works so well in a moment. But first, let me talk about what this introduction does especially well. The physical description is vivid but precise. The man's outfit is eccentric, sure, but not random. Every detail, linen tunic, knee-high moccasin boots, a scabbard with no sword, suggests a history we haven't been told yet, and that's great. One thing I always try to weave in when working with other writers is that effective world building through characters should feel like a question, not a lecture. And this outfit certainly raises questions. Is he a traveler, a deserter, a wanderer from another world? His look doesn't match Amanda's expectations or ours, and that dissonance builds interest. The character voice is also handled with care. Amanda's thoughts have flavor. Godsend, or another nightmare, gives us a peek into her mental state without breaking the flow. The phrase, she must look like she's just survived a living nightmare, because she had, is an especially nice beat. It shows us what she's been through, but also hints that her sense of humor might be hanging on by a thread. And that thread, it matters. When a character reacts with a mix of fear, judgment, and exhaustion, we start to know who they are, not just what they are facing. And I want to pause here for a second, because this is something a lot of writers miss. We don't need to know what happened to Amanda to feel that something happened. Her jump, her thoughts, her quick inventory of the stranger's appearance, they all communicate impact. And that's what strong introductions do. They don't just describe a person, they show how that person bends the world around them. If we'd read the entire story up to this point, we might know exactly what happened to Amanda, but the fact that we didn't need that information here to still feel the scene's impact says a lot about the writing. Now moving on, let me walk you through a few areas where this piece could sharpen even further from my point of view, depending on what kind of story is meant to be told here. First, there's structure and momentum. Currently, the piece opens with Amanda startled, followed by several lines of descriptive thought before the man speaks. That pause creates a quiet reflective mood, but it also gently slows the tension. And if the goal here is to keep the suspense tight, it might help to bring his voice in just a touch sooner. Not a full rewrite, just a light shuffle. Something like this. Amanda jumped about 3 feet, whirled and stared open-mouthed at the man in the middle of the path. Well, on your side, he said. Godsend or another nightmare? Kind dark brown eyes staring back suggested godsend, but tousled, shaggy long blonde hair sticking out every which way said sketchy. What's more, she'd swear that crazy hair was bleached. By slipping his line in earlier, right after she lays eyes on him, we maintain that feeling of being off balance. Now her internal processing becomes a reaction to his presence though, rather than a pause before he engages. It adds immediacy without losing any of the voice or tone that was already established here. Now, if the mood that is aimed for with this character introduction is more disoriented or dreamlike, keeping that space might serve the scene well. But if the goal is to make the reader feel like they are right there in Amanda's shoes, then that little change I just shared might be worth considering. And next up from here then is character layering. The man's odd appearance is clearly designed to raise questions, and Amanda's evaluation of him is part of that. But we might go a little deeper into how her trauma filters those observations. As it stands, her reaction is mostly surface level, confusion, wariness, a flash of judgment about his outfit. But consider how someone who just survived a nightmare might react on a more instinctual level. Would her eyes search for weapons? Would she notice whether he's standing in sunlight or shadow? Would she clock the scabbard first, then the fact that it's empty? These kind of details can pull us further into Amanda's mindset and help define her emotional reality. You don't need to explain what happened to her here, but grounding her perception in survival instincts can make the moment hit harder. For example, instead of, "What's more, she'd swear that crazy hair was bleached," what if it were, "That hair looked sun-bleached, unnatural, deliberate, but it was the scabbard that held her eyes, empty. He'd either lost the blade or didn't need one to be dangerous." Now we get something more grounded, more pointed. There's implied history. She knows what an empty scabbard might mean, a trace of suspicion, and a subtle emotional cue, unease disguised as analysis. And that brings me to one last suggestion, one we already had in prior submissions: stakes. As readers, we're intrigued, but we don't yet know what's riding on this encounter. Amanda lost? Being hunted? You hoping the stranger can help her, or is she terrified he's the next threat? We don't need full exposition here, but even a subtle emotional anchor could make a big difference. One line hinting at what she needs or what she's afraid of would give the scene a bit more narrative pull, in my opinion. Something like, her stomach clenched, empty scabbard, unarmed posture, but something about the way he stood made her fingers twitch toward the nearest stick thick enough to swing. This is simple, concrete. It makes us care a little more about what happens next. So to summarize, this is a strong intro in my opinion. It uses sensory detail, ambiguity, and character contrast to spark immediate curiosity. The tone is clear, the setting feels grounded, and the pacing, while slightly long between action beats, serves as a reflective mood. The main tools for refinement here, in my opinion, are rhythm, emotional filtering, and a touch more character urgency. But the bones are more than solid. Harry has given us something real here, something interesting, something that makes us want to turn the page and ask, who the hell is this guy? And that, honestly, that's what a good character intro should do. But the second most common place writers lose readers is dialogue. So in the next video, I break down 6 real submissions from fantasy writers and show you exactly what makes a conversation snap with personality or fall flat like exposition in disguise.